All right, hi guys. Today we're going to discuss a little bit about how the crowd sentiment during a dip like we've been seeing for the last 2 months or so, almost 2 months or so, has impacted the way prices have attempted to recover, often failing, of course, as we're still sitting at around 46.2K at the moment for Bitcoin. Um, Ethereum is fluctuating just below and just above 3,800 right now. Um, so really what we're trying to discover is how the crowd's perception of crypto right now is impacting where the markets will go next. As we've discussed in many of our previous videos, the path of least expected price outcome is usually where prices go next. So if people think it's all in unity, it's time to buy the dip. Oftentimes it's not yet to buy the dip. Once people stop being interested in buying the dip and there's a bit of capitulation, if you will, which essentially means giving up and deciding you don't want to buy the dip and wait for the next bull rally or just never be in crypto again. That's essentially what we look for to symbolize the start of another bull run. Sort of like back in March 2020 when the COVID news started hitting around the world and everyone panicked. We're selling off S&P, gold and silver were going down, and of course crypto had plummeted over 50% for almost every asset in crypto. So that was a form of capitulation, and of course that's when the almost year and a half long bull run started. Now we're in a time again where it wasn't nearly that kind of dip, but we did just have Bitcoin at above 68K, uh, give or take about 2 months ago, and now we're down to 46K. So that's a pretty big drop. And when we drop over 30% in Bitcoin over that span of time, we start to get a lot of polarization. And what I'm showing you here is uh, one of our recent articles we released called "To Dip or Not to Dip," and it's all about trying to figure out based on the crowd exactly when things are going to turn. And you can look right here at this chart to see that there was major interest in buying the dip. What this chart is measuring is the amount of mentions on Twitter, Reddit, Discord, Telegram, and some pro traders chats that we scrape to see how often buy dips or bot dips have occurred. And we tally those all up, and you can clearly see that when these big spikes occur, there's usually a little bit of flatness. Sometimes things will go up for a little bit. Notice right here, for example, if I were to zoom in, it would be a little more obvious, but right here, when it bottomed out, everyone said it's time to buy the dip. And then it actually did jump just slightly before falling a little further. And after it fell further, you can see how the mentions were starting to really drop off. Blue bars here are the social volume, while yellow lines are the social dominance, so the percentage of discussion related to these words compared to all discussions. Um, so you can see here, for example, it's a little more clear. This spike had buy the dip right at the bottom, tiny little spike, and then further downside until when it actually jumped up and got up to here, look at how there wasn't that much interest in buying the dip anymore. The biggest, of course, is what's circled, and that was the huge bunch of buy the dip mentions that occurred uh, in early December. I believe this was December 3rd when the big plummet happened. It actually got down to around 43K at that time for Bitcoin before jumping up a little bit. And as the price was rising, people were saying, buy the dip, buy the dip. It's still way below here, so it's still technically a dip. And then, boom, it started to go down as buy the dip mentions kept on going and people were saying, okay, it's still a dip, just back to where we were before. More buying the dip seems like the right option. And the price basically continued to fluctuate. Of course, went up a little, but look at how this time around there wasn't that much buy the dip mentioned. We had one more, a little bit of buy the dip interest, and it's kind of ranged ever since. Notice how right around here, December 19th, I think, is when it started to bottom out once and for all and range up while there was barely any mention of buying the dip. And that's exactly what you want to look for. If you're riding this wave, you want to make sure that the crowd isn't in unison, all saying, yep, keep buying the dip, keep buying the dip. You want them to continue to doubt that this is actually a legitimate rise because when they all think, oh, if we buy now, we're just going to get fooled like we did back here, um, that's a good indication that the price will actually go up because those key stakeholders, the large whales who are looking for the cheapest opportunities to get in, they're trying to buy crypto from those people who are contrarian and against crypto's price going up. That's how they get in the cheapest. That's how they get the best value. Rinse and repeat. And then on the other side, of course, if people are saying that it's time to short, that's when the price can really go up too. So if we were to look at, this is by the dip, so this is basically a repeat of what we were just looking at on that article. Let's say I put in short, and I'll turn on social dominance as well. So notice how there was this big spike in shorting that just started, I think, in the last few hours. This indicates that people aren't really believers of this very minor uptick to about 46.7 where we were at after getting down to about 46.2 earlier today. Not much of an uptick, but clearly there's some event that is causing many people to believe that the price will not stay up this high and continue to go down. And that's a good sign because contrarians to this notion that it's time to short might be whales who can buy in for cheap while everyone else is panic selling. This isn't a massive spike, obviously. We've seen much bigger spikes back here when we were just recovering from like the September crash that occurred. I think September 7th is when we had that big crash, and it was just starting to recover in October. And look at all these people saying it's time to short, time to short. This isn't relatively as big, but it's at least the biggest we've seen since about a month ago, a little under a month ago, 4 weeks, mind you. So this is an indication that there could be something brewing that's good for the bulls if you're, perhaps looking to go against what the crowd notion is. It would be a little more clear if the spike was way up here or something, but all things considered, a 4 week high in shorting is significant enough to keep an eye on it. You can even break down, where the spikes are occurring. It doesn't appear that there's much conversation about shorting on Telegram, not so much on Reddit. Pretty decent size on Twitter, though. And this is likely where it occurs. We don't have social dominance independently for each platform, but considering it's kind of off hours at the time of this recording, and we're still getting a pretty big spike here, that means that the percentage of discussion related to shorting compared to everything else is actually pretty sizable, and that would explain the social dominance jumping up to here, almost 1% of discussions relating to short. So going back to the article for a minute, we've discussed how this wasn't the final dip, just as our staff member circled right here, because there was so much kind of common agreement that it was the dip. And then the lower interest over here indicated that it was actually more like an actual dip occurrence could occur. And that's kind of what happened for about the span of 10 days. So if we go down here, we can look at it another way. This is the social volume and weighted sentiment of Bitcoin. Social volume is very obvious. It's just the overall amount of mentions of Bitcoin in this case. And then weighted sentiment's a bit more complex. What we do is we calculate the positive versus negative ratio of comments related to Bitcoin, and then we multiply that by these blue bars, the overall social volume of Bitcoin. And that gives us kind of a perception of just how many people are talking about Bitcoin, and also whether those actual discussions tend to veer more positive or more negative. As you are likely seeing just as I talk here, the really big spikes in positivity and euphoria, these are signals that people are getting greedy. Sometimes they might get greedy and still ride up a wave for a little while longer. And then other times, right when they're at their greediest, that's when the price drops off a cliff, as it did back on May 13th to 18th or so. I think 19th is when this first bottom occurred. So in this case, this pink bar can be really telling. You can see that our staff member circled when it was really at its most negative here in mid-July. And you see another one here in mid-September. And these are usually indicative of bottoms because people are becoming too fearful. They think that the price is going to go down forever, so you better jump out now so you don't lose any more. Those are the mistakes that a lot of traders make, is selling when there's a bottom and buying when there's a top. And this pink bar, weighted sentiment, really gives a nice indication of just how extreme that is, rather than kind of just anecdotally checking by how many people are mentioning, good or bad things on your Twitter feed. This scrapes everything and makes it much, much easier to conceptualize. So right now, after a very, very euphoric run, understandably, as we got two separate all-time highs, one in mid-October and one in mid-November, people were very euphoric, all talking about when's 70K, when's 100K, all of these really gaudy numbers, and then boom, we had this big drop off on December 3rd, and you can see that gradually people started to, you know, people were talking about about buying the dip, as we just saw in the last chart, and gradually we saw that the sentiment dropped into negative territory. This line equals the historic average sentiment of Bitcoin, for I believe 8+ years that we have data on. And as soon as it started dropping into negative sentiment, look at how the price bounced back up. But people still don't seem to believe it. And that's actually a good thing, because even though the price bounced up, the sentiment has just gone further down because people are saying, um, this is not the bottom yet. People were talking a lot about taxes, which we saw on social trends, uh, reasons why profit is being taken. People are looking at whale activity and all sorts of on-chain metrics that look a bit underwhelming right now. So understandably, a lot of people are kind of doubting that the price can actually reclaim 50K and above. And that is a good thing. Just like we talked about with the buy the dip mentions, when people stop mentioning that it's time to buy the dip, which we're starting to see now, and that would align with the negative sentiment, that is indicative of at least mild capitulation and can very well lead to another uptick. Now, of course, this is one of many metrics, and we have to take into account, how on-chain activity is doing, how whale activity is doing. I covered that just a few days ago in a recent video. If you want, you can check out our last one. But all things considered, sentiment does very heavily drive where markets go next. And right now, sentiment appears to be quite negative. In fact, looking right now where we are, we're at our most negative we've been in at least the last year. That's significant. That's a very long stretch of time where we didn't see levels quite to this extent. So keep that in mind. We'll keep this video brief, but if you guys have follow-up questions, feel free to ask here in the comments or come to our Discord server. We would love to chat with you, whether you're a Sandbase Pro member or not. If you do want to be a Sandbase Pro member, remember that making a free account will give you 2 weeks free right off the bat, and you can instantly get 35% off if you become a paid Pro member before January 7th. Just enter code SANHOLIDAYS21 at checkout, and we'll take care of you. Make sure you're all set up, and we'll be there to help navigate our metrics any way we possibly can. Much love to everybody. Hope you're having a good start to the new year here, and stay safe. Talk to y'all soon.